Welcome to Studying Law Around the World. I'm Claudio Klaus. In each episode, I talk with lawyers, law students, and professors from different parts of the world to talk about legal education, careers, and what the profession looks like in real life. We talk about the hard parts, the surprises, and the decisions that shaped their paths. Whether you're planning to study abroad, thinking about working in another legal system, or just curious about how law works around the world, this podcast is for you. Today, I'm interviewing Gregory Radisic. He has a very interesting area of law in which he works and studies. He's a fellow on the Center for Space, Cyberspace and Data Law. He's also a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Law of Bond University. He holds a JD and LLM and is also an admitted barrister and solicitor in Alberta. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me today, Gregory.
Happy to be here. Very excited to talk to you.
Thank you. And to start off our podcast, I'd love for you to introduce yourself and maybe tell us a little bit about how did you find your way into international and space law?
Yeah, I would love to. My name's Gregory Radisic. I'm a Canadian lawyer. Besides what you mentioned, I'm also a teaching fellow at Bond University. Oh, now I'm stepping to the roles of a teacher and teaching the next generation and sharing my passions. My work basically sits at the intersection of international law, regulation, and legal governance. And all of that hinges on how quickly we're moving technologically around the world, especially in the aerospace industry. I didn't start in space. My background was initially in science, in corporate law. And during law school, that's when these ideas started kind of becoming cultivated. I realized that, or became very interested in how law responds. Technology moves faster than does, right? So I got into space law basically just by luck. I was doing some internships at the UN and ended up getting to do an internship at the UN's space office called the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs, which sounds very, very impressive and exciting. But I realized doing policy work and legal work there was just kind of the same as anywhere else. You're trying to provide your clients with good, timely information. And if you can't find it, you're kind of giving your best guess. And as I was working in that system, it was pretty visible. You're working with treaties that were made in the 1960s, some 1970s, but really, last 50 years, there's been principles and guidelines being agreed upon, but not much in terms of hard international law in the treaty form. And that's where it's a mismatch because innovations move really well. If you think about the first moon lander versus one of the yes, some of the rocket technology is the same, but the science on board is very different. I thought, well, why hasn't law caught up? And that's when I got interested. I then was able to work at the European Space Agency in the office of the Director General, which really showed me the side of space diplomacy. And then I began kind of going all in. So I did my LLM, which is where we met. I'm at the University of Toronto. And after that, during that and after that, I've been working pretty much pro bono at a number of international organizations, helping them with their advocacy work, whether that's for all mankind, which you mentioned, which works to advocate for protections and international legal protections for objects that are based on the moon. So think of the Apollo lander or the first footprints or Luna 2. We don't have any style treaty with those objects, or with the Center for Space, Cyberspace and Data Law, which is an Australian body that really is looking at the intersection of all of those items and all those technologies and seeing how can we ethically use data and AI and tech in the space industry moving forward. So it's been really interesting. It's definitely an exciting career. You've talked to a lot of interesting people, but it's not rocket science. I like to say it's just international law. So yeah, that's a little bit about my story and my kind of upbringing in space law, I guess.
Love that. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. It is kind of a niche area, right? I imagine that, from all your cohort of law colleagues, I don't imagine that more than you and someone else might have been studying this area, which I find it like fascinating of how much you can do with a law degree always. And I'm curious to know as well, you said it kind of happened to you. After now like over 100 interviews in the podcast, I've learned that there's a lot of people that would say things like I ended up choosing to go to law school because of XYZ, and I stayed in the profession because of these other points. I'm curious as well when talking about space law. You mentioned a little bit of the path of how you got there, but I'm also curious to know a little more about like why did you decide to stay with this area of law?
Yeah, great question. So, not the first time I've been asked that question. I was working in an area of criminal law, broadly called national security law. And when I first stepped foot as a UN intern, well, not stepped foot, so I first started working, I guess, as a UN intern, I was working for the terrorism prevention branch of the UNODC, which is the Office of Drugs and that was, really interesting. So passionate. I was going to law school. I was like, "I wanna do this national security law stuff. It's really interesting. It's" I want to work for my country. I would love to kind of help with that whole infrastructure, and I was working with, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear, weapons prevention. So there's a few treaties that exist worldwide, and we're getting countries in southern part of Africa to sign on to the treaties, and I was planning large conferences and writing editing large-scale reports that are now published on the UN website. It was really exciting, but I realized that that area of law is very pessimistic, and it looked at what kind of the worst of humanity in a way, right? So you have these people, and they're really trying their best, but yet humanity is persisting and causing more and more problems. And it's definitely a very needed area of law. Everything that they do is fantastic. And I would there again in a heartbeat. But I then space because it had a lot of the same elements. It had national security elements. It had a lot of defense considerations. You basically either work for a government or a large national organization or a company that in turn has contracts with those players. But it's way more optimistic. If you think about the major inflection points in history, the Cold War, for example. That was happening, but somehow Russia and the United States were eventually able to work together on projects like the International Space Center and Space Station. And no matter how crazy things got on Earth, for whatever reason, they put those differences aside to work together in those domains. And that's only increased. There are now way more spacefaring nations than there once were. You have China and Canada that are way more present, emerging space nations that some countries are just getting satellite. And it really an area of law and an area in industry where you're trying to pull each other up and bring people with you for the technological innovations that exist and that come alongside space. So I found it very positive, and that's why I made that shift. It motivates you. You work with very interesting people. I'm very lucky. I can count many rocket scientists and people who own space companies that do everything from defense things to, I don't know, launching rockets in space. And they're my friends, and I get to talk to them every day and, hear their legal problems and what they're dealing with. And it's kind of funny. At the end of the day, it's the same legal problems that a startup or a coffee shop didn't have. I'm having a procurement problem. I don't know how to get something across the border. I don't know where I should put my money or how do I attract someone to be like, it's all of these kind of very basic business fundamentals, but applied to a really interesting industry with real people. So yeah, it's been really fun. And that's why I made that shift. And that's why I've stayed in that niche. But you're very right. There's not many people doing it in Canada. I saw an interview with someone and it said there's a very generous handful now of space lawyers in Canada. And that's two categories. There's the ones that have been teaching and are probably 60 plus now. And then now, which is really interesting, there's this new guard of very inspired kind of 20 to 30-year-olds that are now seeing this as a possible profession. Um, and it's really interesting when you go to these international forums and you go, oh, there's another one, there's another Canadian one, or there's another Australian one. But yeah, it's been really very, very interesting exploring this niche, and I definitely will be sticking with it.
Amazing. No, very, very insightful to learn a little more about this. And I was doing a little bit of a research before us getting together here today, and I saw that your specific research touches on very big questions like lunar heritage, dark skies, and peaceful use of outer space. So I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit more about that, and maybe even why those issues really matter in a legal perspective and for like society more broadly.
So all of those issues are about how should we as a global community treat a global commons, right? So that's an area of the world where ideally everyone has some form of access to it, not just physically, but technologically, and also access to the benefits of it, right? So why should Canada benefit from space more than, I don't know, Mozambique? Basically, we both have of opportunity to benefit from the resources that come out of space, benefit from technology that's used in space. So that's not necessarily how things have been working thus far. And that's really been motivating me to focus my writings in that area. Both disputes should be resolved in that area on ways in which diplomats in Vienna and Geneva, New York should be discussing these issues. I'll give you one example. So this week, very timely that you and I are talking, this week Elon Musk announced, well, not Elon Musk, but SpaceX announced that they've filed paperwork with the FCC to put 1 million satellites in orbit. For context, there's maybe 11 to 12,000 satellites in orbit right now. So right now, when you look up at the night sky, you don't really, maybe you'll see some things from a city, you might see something moving. And if you go into the countryside or far north in Canada, you definitely see some things moving. But when it comes to 1 million satellites, you'll look up and you'll see 20,000 at any given spot where you are. It'll completely change what the night sky looks like. So for the first time in human history, the next generation won't have the same view of the night sky as the current one if this plan goes through. I'm not saying it should, not saying it shouldn't, but that's a consideration that needs to be made on, is there some way we can mitigate that? Who allows that? He filed paperwork with the United States. Is that all you need to do? Because it's going to impact a child in the Inuit who maybe uses the night sky for 6 months of the year to find their way across the Arctic and hunt, or it might affect someone in South America because they'll now have an impacted view, right? And those are almost more like sociocultural questions of like, well, what changes when what changes for the next generation? And that's the same with my work with For All Mankind on lunar heritage. Do we want a legal regime where it's finders keepers? If my company is created tomorrow to go to the moon and bring back every artifact from every mission that's happened in the past 70, 80 years and put those into auction, is that something that should happen? Should that not be in a museum? And you've kind of been seeing, if you were to do a quick Google search, you'd be seeing over time more and more of these kind of space relics finding their way into it makes you a lot of money. If anything has been to the moon and come back, even if it's a bolt, you'll see some funny things. It'll be like piece of insulation from the Apollo mission or something, and it'll go for thousands and thousands of dollars. So you can imagine the profit to be made. But what do we lose as a human species if I land my rocket next to the Apollo and I wipe the footprint that was on the moon, right? Should we not protect that area? Should we not, I don't know, save it to inspire the next generation some way, shape, or form? How that looks like right now is to be determined. But, these are questions that 20 years ago, you'd probably talk to your law professor or your lawyer friends and they'd be rolling their eyes at. And now it's genuine conversations that are happening. We have the first lunar mission in decades going to the moon. That was supposed to be this coming week. It's now been rescheduled to March. Who knows if it'll happen on time, but they're going to the moon and back for the first time. They want boots on the ground in the coming years. They want to establish things like lunar bases. And a lot of these conversations are ongoing. They're moving slowly, but it's not unless people advocate for some change that those perspectives will be included in what the future of space looks like, the impacts that it can have on such a global area of law, and that has very global implications for everyone.
Wow, extremely insightful. Very, very interesting to hear a little bit about that. And it really gets you thinking. I can see how it's really fascinating to work with that and get to discuss these topics every day. Something that I always like to bring up to the podcast here. So as you might know, a lot of the listeners here in the podcast are early career professionals. And some of the questions that I end up getting every once in a while are about, ask lawyers a little more about, their careers and how they go about doing things. And something that I thought it was quite impressive is that you're balancing, legal practice, you're teaching, you're studying PhD, you are, doing research and policy work. So I wanted to ask you a little more about, how do you find balance and how do you decide where to focus your energy, and maybe, what kinds of trade-offs do you do, to be able to handle all of these things at the same time?
Good question. I think in law school, and you might have experienced this yourself, Claudio, is there's a really efficient funnel that's been made for students entering law school, getting a job at a law firm, usually either corporate side or criminal family side, articling, and then ideally staying in that job until you retire 40 years from now. And that's a model that's worked for a long time. Occasionally you have people that push outside of that model, even just on a basic level. If you think 100 years ago, there are people who said, instead I'll be a politician, or even working for the government in certain ways that are unique. So it was interesting at school. Some professors, a lot of people didn't, a lot of peers did not. And they go, how are you going to make a living working in international law? You'd hear phrases like international law is not really a thing. Oh, it's corporate international law, or, you have to pick a niche. And that's fair. But international law is definitely a thing. And it's definitely a thing that a lot of people pursue and do. I find that you have to make a decision. You have to have a sense of certainty in yourself, and then you just have to go for it and persevere. And it takes years and years, to be frank. But if you keep applying for, I don't know, for scholarships to go and attend some of these conferences, or apply for internships or papers, well, you might find yourself in rooms that man, and then eventually you'll realize maybe that is the place I should be. And I do now blog in it because I've been in it one time, so the second time's not so hard. And yeah, so I think I'm struggling to remember your question, but I think moving from law school to practice is challenging no matter what, and doing that in an area that's unique and kind of less frequently followed requires a lot of a stiff upper lip, a lot of perseverance, a lot of adaptation. So how have I done it was your question. And I find that I'm very curious and I can get very bored easily. And that was one of the things I didn't like with a purely corporate legal practice. I used to work at a law firm, and while it was a fantastic learning opportunity, it showed me kind of what areas I'm not interested in. Great skills, So I think you need to learn somewhere. Choosing where you article is always very important. If you can do that at a large national firm, what an amazing opportunity to learn. But it doesn't mean you have to stay there for the rest of your life. So right now I work remotely, and I work remotely for a government organization in Alberta. I also do all my pro bono work kind of around the clock whenever people are available, because I am now based in Brisbane, Australia, and there are others that are, I work with people in Europe, I work with people in North America, I work with people in South America. So a lot of different time zones and scheduling conflicts. But, you wake up early and you have a meeting at 4:30 in the morning, but that means you get to meet with a rocket scientist in Alabama and a startup in Vienna. That's really interesting. It's really cool, and you pursue your passions. And then the teaching and everything kind of fits into conversation is a legal profession. It's maybe it's a bit early for me. I just turned 30, but like the idea of giving back and helping to again bring people with you is very ingrained in uh, the space industry, like I said. And it's also very ingrained in the legal industry, although sometimes some lawyers do it more than others. So I always find it very important to try to share the knowledge that I've gained, try to share the insights of my research, connect with as many students as possible, and then bring them into the fold if there's an opportunity to do so. So that's why I have that teaching element and lecturing element to my career. But yeah, like I don't think a legal practice has to be just one thing. I think you really do benefit from having multiple different avenues in it. And, you have the typical corporate job, you have some pro bono work, you have some advocacy work, and teaching work. And that really just makes you a better lawyer, I think, at the end of the day, because you learn from people in each one of those spheres and are able to apply it to whatever problems in front of you. Because really, at the end of the day, law is just solving people's issues and problems. It's trying to make it simple for them. So yeah, that's kind of been the process going forward. It can be chaotic, but it's definitely worthwhile. It's worth the early mornings or late nights every single time.
Fantastic. No, very happy to hear that. And it's funny you just mentioned that, because then I realized that it's probably like the morning for you now, 7 p.m. Toronto time, what, 10 a.m. Australia?
Yes, I'm in the future. So for me, it's
Yeah.
tomorrow.
So
It's always interesting. Yeah, scheduling can be rough because you go, let's meet Friday at this time. And they go, Friday, your time or my time? Because for me, it's Saturday.
it makes a
Yeah,
difference. Yeah.
it's some problems. It always makes a difference.
No, that's awesome. But to wrap up today's episode, I wanted to ask you, if I were a law student listening to this episode, and I want to explore a little bit of space law, what would you give as an advice for somebody who wants to have a taste of it? Not sure if I want to do this for the rest of my life, but thought I want to like dig in a little bit. What are a few maybe like papers to read or associations to be in touch with and attend events of? Are there a few, things that you would recommend?
Yes. So it's funny. My advice would be don't start by getting into space law. See see more broadly what you like. So one, take that weird course that none of your friends are taking if that's of interest to you. Maybe start with an international law course. There's always a chapter on space. There's always a chapter on maritime law. There's a lot of Antarctic and Arctic conversations. A lot of these deal with global commons. Even cyberspace, in a way, deals with global commons. Start broad and then get more specific based on what you're reading, what you're liking. If you know you want to go into the space industry, Canada has such a vibrant space industry, and a lot of the conferences are Ottawa. There's one called SEDS, SEDS. I do not know the acronym, but it is uh, basically geared at youth. There's another organization that's more international that always is accepting people to participate in their working groups and the conferences, and it's called SGAC, so the Space Generation Advisory Council. And it's a advisory council that was made by the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space and UNOOSA, Office of Outer Space Affairs, to really get the youth perspective. And they have legal working groups, they have industry working groups, they talk about policy, they talk about science, but it's really people under the age of 35 or younger. They have a conference every year that lines up with something called the International Astronautical Congress, which is the largest space conference in the world. It's usually the first 3 days of that, and then for the rest of it, you get to enjoy the larger conference. It will so many people that likely will become lifelong friends. I went last year, and it's a fantastic entry point because there are some people who are working at, I don't know, Blue Origin in the United States and have had long careers and they're 34. And then there's the student that's 19 going, I think I'm just really interested in this. So I wanted to come and check it out. And they have fantastic scholarships, full, they'll pay for all your expenses, flights, everything to get out there. So as a space lawyer, a young lawyer is usually between the ages of 21 in Canada and 35. So that's an avenue where you can say, I really want to break into the space. Here's everything I've done in the past. I want to apply, I don't know, corporate law to space. Realistically, space law is just a combination of all these laws that exist on Earth and how it's applied into the space industry or into the global commons more generally. So let's say you're interested in AI. I mean, AI, or it's funny, like criminal law now. Canada has a law about, I think, committing murder on the moon, and they changed their rules now in the criminal code to include kind of out of the country rules that will apply to a lunar base one day or to the ISS. So there's a lot of ways you can combine law in unique ways with space, and those are conversations that really, for the most part, haven't happened yet, and you can get involved those ways. So those are great organizations where you dip your toe in, very low, if no, financial barrier to entry, and that's fantastic. And on a final note, the Canadian Space Agency has also fantastic scholarships. So anytime they have a grant and scholarship scheme, anytime that you write a paper or get asked or pitch a presentation at one of these larger conferences, you can apply to them, student. And again, stipend to fly out, it's in, or if it's in Canada, they'll likely give you a stipend for accommodation, for food, and that's their way of really incentivizing and encouraging exploration in space from an academic standpoint for youth. So they're also a fantastic avenue in Canada to look at and consider.
Fantastic. I really appreciate you taking the time to come in the podcast, share a little bit more about this fascinating area and also the very interesting projects you're researching and working on. And I hope you all enjoyed the episode, and I'll see you on the next one.
Thank you so much. Bye.